Listen closely, can you hear it? That faint, almost imperceptible sound beneath the weight of centuries. A whisper that has traveled through dust and time to reach us here, now. It is the echo of a voice that history tried to silence, a story that was never meant to be told. For too long, our understanding of the ancient world has been a grand narrative built on the deeds of kings and conquerors, a chronicle written in stone and celebrated in epic poems. But what of the other half of humanity? What of the women who ruled empires, commanded armies, deciphered the stars, and whispered counsel that changed the course of civilizations? Their stories were not carved into monuments. They were passed down as secrets, surviving only as fragments, as rumors, as the ghostly imprint of a presence that power could not entirely erase. Today, we are going to follow those whispers. We embark on a journey to reclaim these lost voices, to step beyond the familiar tales and into the shadows where extraordinary women waited. This is not a simple list of names and dates. It is an excavation of legacy. We will travel from the sun-baked banks of the Nile to the bustling forums of Rome, from the mystical temples of Mesopotamia to the fierce battlefields of forgotten tribes. We will meet pharaohs who dared to wear the beard of a king, priestesses who held the keys to divine knowledge, warriors who fought with a ferocity that stunned their enemies, and scholars whose intellect illuminated their age. These are not merely footnotes, they are the central characters in a parallel history that has been waiting patiently for its moment in the light. This exploration is about more than just correcting the historical record. It is about understanding the full, vibrant tapestry of our shared past. By uncovering the lives of these formidable women, we gain a deeper, more nuanced appreciation for the ancient world, a world where influence could be wielded from a throne room or a temple chamber, where power could be as subtle as a whispered prophecy or as undeniable as a queen's decree. So let us quiet the roar of the familiar narratives and lean in, because the most compelling stories are often the ones we have yet to hear. The journey into whispered history begins now. Our journey into the shadows begins along the fertile banks of the Nile, in a land where gods walked among mortals and the pharaoh was their living representative. Here, in the brilliant glare of the Egyptian sun, we find one of history's most audacious acts of self-creation. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her story is a masterclass in reshaping reality itself. She was born a king's daughter, which in itself was a position of immense honor, but the throne of Egypt was traditionally reserved for sons. Fate, however, has a way of disrupting the most rigid of plans. When her husband, who was also her half-brother, Pharaoh Thutmose II, died unexpectedly, the heir to the throne was just an infant, a boy named Thutmose III. As was customary, Hatshepsut stepped into the role of regent, the power behind the throne, expected to guide the kingdom until the boy came of age. For a few years she ruled in his name, but then something extraordinary happened. She did not simply hold the seat warm for another. She decided to take it for herself. This was not a quiet, behind-the-scenes grip on power. It was a bold, public, and meticulously orchestrated campaign to become pharaoh in her own right. To understand the sheer scale of this undertaking, we must appreciate that the title of pharaoh was deeply intertwined with masculinity. The pharaoh was the incarnation of the god Horus, a warrior and a protector. The concept of a female king was, for all intents and purposes, a contradiction in terms within the Egyptian worldview. Hatshepsut understood that to rule effectively, she needed to bridge this ideological gap. And so, she launched a revolution not with weapons but with words and images. She began an unparalleled propaganda campaign, commissioning hundreds of statues, reliefs, and monuments that redefined her very identity. In these artworks, she is depicted not as a queen but as a male pharaoh. She is shown with the broad, bare chest of a man, wearing the traditional kilt and the striped Nemes headdress. Most strikingly, she is almost always portrayed with the iconic false beard, the definitive symbol of pharaonic power. This was not an attempt to hide her gender, but rather to transcend it. Inscriptions accompanying these images consistently use male pronouns, referring to her as the son of Ra. She was creating a divine justification for her rule, claiming her father, the god Ammon, had intended for her to be king all along. And what a reign it was! For over 20 years, Hatshepsut presided over an era of remarkable peace and economic flourishing. While previous pharaohs had focused on military conquest, she championed commerce and grand architectural projects. Her most famous achievement was the legendary trading expedition to the land of Punt, a place shrouded in mystery, likely located near modern-day Somalia. The reliefs at her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri vividly depict this venture, showing Egyptian ships returning laden with treasures unimaginable to her people. Stacks of fragrant myrrh resin, sacks of precious ebony and ivory, live myrrh trees to be planted in the gardens of Ammon, and exotic animals like monkeys and panthers. This was not a raid, it was a diplomatic and commercial triumph that brought immense wealth and prestige to Egypt. She built and restored temples throughout the land, leaving a permanent mark on the skyline of the civilization, ensuring that her name and her legacy would be remembered for eternity. Or so she thought, because after her death the story takes a mysterious turn. Her stepson, Thutmose III, who eventually did become pharaoh, initiated a campaign to systematically erase her from history. Her statues were torn down, her cartouches chiseled off walls, her magnificent temple obscured. It was an act of damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. For centuries, Hatshepsut became the lost pharaoh, her existence reduced to a whisper, a gap in the king lists that puzzled archaeologists. It was only through the patient work of modern Egyptologists, piecing together the fragments she left behind, that her full story has been resurrected, allowing us to hear once more the voice of the woman who dared to become a king. But the grandeur of Hatshepsut's reign gives way to one of ancient history's most captivating puzzles. For decades after her death, her stepson Thutmose III ruled as a supremely successful pharaoh, a military genius who expanded the Egyptian empire to its greatest extent. He did not touch her monuments during the early part of his sole rule. Then, toward the end of his life, something shifted. A campaign began, not of random vandalism, but of a precise and systematic eradication. Stonemasons were sent across Egypt to dismantle her legacy. Her magnificent statues were smashed, their fragments buried in a pit near her temple. On the temple walls themselves, her image was carefully chiseled away, and the carved hieroglyphs that spelled out her royal name, her cartouche, were meticulously gouged out, leaving behind ghostly blank spaces in the middle of intricate reliefs. This was an official act of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The question that has echoed down the centuries is a simple one. Why would a powerful and secure king, so late in his own reign, bother to erase a woman who had been dead for 20 years? Historians have proposed several compelling theories, each offering a different window into the minds of the ancients. The most dramatic explanation suggests a motive of long-simmering personal vengeance. Imagine Thutmose III, the rightful male heir, forced to wait in the wings for 2 decades while his stepmother ruled with unparalleled confidence. Perhaps this erasure was an act of pure spite, a final, bitter revenge for years of perceived humiliation and postponed power. It's a compelling human story, but the timeline makes it less likely. If he harbored such deep resentment, why wait until the very end of his life to act? A more political theory posits that Thutmose was securing the succession for his own son, Amenhotep II. By erasing the precedent of a powerful female pharaoh, he was reinforcing the rigid, male-dominated line of succession. He was, in effect, closing a dangerous loophole, ensuring that no future queen could ever use Hatshepsut's reign as a justification to seize the throne from a legitimate male heir. This act of erasure, then, was not about the past but about the future, a harsh political necessity to stabilize the dynasty. Yet another interpretation views the campaign not as malicious destruction, but as a form of ritual correction. In the Egyptian belief system, order, known as Mat, was paramount. A female king may have been seen, in retrospect, as a disruption to the natural cosmic order. By removing her images and names, Thutmose could have been attempting to restore Mat, to set the divine balance right for the afterlife. He wasn't necessarily trying to punish Hatshepsut personally, but to correct a perceived irregularity in the sacred history of Egypt. Intriguingly, the erasure was not entirely consistent. In some very prominent places, like the towering obelisk she erected at Karnak, her cartouches were left intact, perhaps because they were too high up, too difficult to reach, or maybe because they contained deep dedications to the god Ammon, and defacing them would have been a greater sacrilege than allowing her name to remain. This selectivity adds another layer of mystery to the entire endeavor. The very act of erasure, however, became the key to her rediscovery. For centuries, Hatshepsut was a ghost, a missing pharaoh hinted at in fragmented records. The work of archaeologists like Howard Carter, who discovered her tomb, and others who studied the Deir el-Bahari temple, was like assembling a colossal jigsaw puzzle. The blank spaces on the walls told a story of their own. By noting where a figure had been removed and by studying the style of the remaining artwork, scholars could deduce who that missing figure was. In a stunning twist of fate, the ancient workmen who buried the fragments of her statues intended for disposal actually preserved them for modern discovery. When these pieces were excavated and painstakingly reassembled, the image of the female pharaoh re-emerged from the sands. The attempts to obliterate her memory ultimately guaranteed her immortality, transforming her from a forgotten ruler into a symbol of resilience. The chisel marks of Thutmose III did not silence Hatshepsut. They became a permanent part of her story, a testament to a power so formidable that it had to be physically carved out of history. Yet the sands of Egypt hold more than one story of a woman who defied expectation, and our journey now carries us forward more than 1,000 years to the final dramatic chapter of pharaonic rule. Here we encounter a figure so shrouded in legend that the real woman has often been lost. Her name is Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, and to dismiss her as the mere seductress of Roman propaganda is to miss one of history's most brilliant political minds. The image we have inherited of a temptress who used her charms to beguile powerful men was largely crafted by her enemies in Rome, a narrative designed to discredit her and justify her ultimate defeat. To understand Cleopatra, we must look past this caricature and see the ruler she truly was. A linguist, a naval commander, an economist, and a master strategist fighting a desperate, decades-long campaign to save her ancient kingdom from being swallowed by the Roman Republic. Her political education began in the most brutal of classrooms, the Ptolemaic court. She was born into a dynasty known for its vicious internal power struggles, where siblings and spouses frequently plotted against one another for the throne. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died, 18-year-old Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, were named joint rulers as was the custom. But she had no intention of sharing power with a child dominated by ambitious courtiers. She quickly moved to assert her sole authority, demonstrating an early understanding of statecraft. This boldness led to her being driven out of Alexandria by her brother's faction, forcing her into exile. It was at this moment of profound vulnerability, gathering a mercenary army in Syria, that she saw her opportunity in the form of a visiting Roman general, Julius Caesar, who had arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival. What followed was not a seduction but a strategic masterstroke. Knowing she needed the backing of Rome's most powerful man, she arranged a legendary audience. Historical accounts say she had herself rolled up inside a carpet or a bed sack to be smuggled past her brother's guards and into Caesar's quarters. When unrolled, she appeared before him not as a supplicant but as a fellow ruler prepared to negotiate. This was a calculated gamble that showcased her courage and intelligence. Caesar, a seasoned politician, was undoubtedly impressed not just by her daring, but by her clear-sighted political proposal. He recognized in her a valuable and capable ally. Their alliance was first and foremost a political and military partnership. With Caesar's legions, Cleopatra was restored to the throne. She became his lover and bore him a son, Caesarion, cementing a bond that tied her dynasty directly to the heart of Roman power, but her ambitions were for Egypt. She accompanied Caesar to Rome, where she stayed as a respected head of state, witnessing the inner workings of the Republic. Her goal was to secure Roman support for Egyptian sovereignty, and for a time it seemed to work. After Caesar's assassination, however, the political landscape shattered, and Cleopatra had to navigate a new and dangerous reality. She returned to Egypt and focused on domestic stability, demonstrating her skills as an administrator. She took a keen interest in her kingdom's economic health, actively promoting trade and managing the crucial grain supply that made Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. She was one of the first Ptolemaic rulers to actually speak the Egyptian language, in addition to being fluent in Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and several other tongues. This was not merely a personal accomplishment, it was a deliberate political act to connect with her subjects and strengthen her legitimacy, moving beyond the isolated Greek-speaking elite of her predecessors. When the next chapter of Rome's civil war arrived on her doorstep in the form of Mark Antony, Cleopatra once again engaged in high-stakes diplomacy. Their meeting was a spectacle of power and persuasion, each sizing up the other's needs. Antony required Egypt's vast wealth to fund his military campaigns against his rival Octavian. Cleopatra required a Roman patron to protect Egypt's independence. What is often portrayed as a decadent love affair was, in reality, a complex political and military merger. They formed a coalition, and Cleopatra actively participated in the planning and logistics of their campaigns. She commanded her own fleet of warships at the pivotal Battle of Actium, a testament to her role as a military partner, not a passive consort. Together, they envisioned a new order for the Eastern Mediterranean, one where Egypt would stand as an equal partner with Rome. This vision, however, was their undoing. Octavian, a master of propaganda, successfully painted Antony as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, a traitor to Rome who wished to move the capital to Alexandria. The defeat at Actium sealed their fate. In the end, Cleopatra's profound understanding of power and politics was not enough to overcome the overwhelming military and rhetorical force of Rome. Her choice to die by suicide rather than be paraded through Rome as a trophy in Octavian's triumph was her final, defiant act of statecraft. It was the last decision of a sovereign, ensuring her story would be written on her own terms, a final whisper of a pharaoh's authority that echoes far louder than the slander of her conquerors. But the story of Cleopatra does not end with her death. In many ways, it was there that the great distortion of her legacy truly began. The circumstances surrounding her final moments are a historical maze, filled with conflicting accounts and enduring questions that have fascinated scholars for 2,000 years. The most famous version, immortalized by writers like Plutarch, tells us that after Mark Antony's death, Cleopatra, imprisoned by Octavian in her own palace, chose to end her life rather than suffer the humiliation of being displayed in chains during his Roman triumph. The method, we are told, was the bite of an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra delivered to her in a basket of figs. This image is powerfully cinematic. The queen, robed in her royal regalia, applying the serpent to her skin as the ultimate act of defiance. Yet the historical reality is far less certain. Other ancient sources suggest she may have used a poisoned hairpin or a concealed vial of toxin. The asp story, however, carries a profound symbolic weight that Cleopatra, a master of political theater, would have understood perfectly. In Egyptian mythology, the cobra, or uraeus, was the symbol of divine royalty, worn on the crown of the pharaoh as a protective emblem. To die by its bite was not a common suicide, it was a ritual act. It transformed her death from a personal tragedy into a sacred transition, aligning her with the gods of her homeland. She was not merely dying, she was becoming an immortal symbol of Egypt itself, a final, brilliant piece of statecraft designed to deny her enemy a complete victory. This carefully crafted final act, however, was no match for the propaganda machine of her conqueror Octavian, who would soon become the Emperor Augustus. He needed to justify his civil war against a fellow Roman, Mark Antony, and he did so by painting Cleopatra as the true enemy. In his narrative, she was not a shrewd political leader protecting her kingdom, but a sinister and decadent Oriental queen who had used dark magic and sexual witchcraft to enslave the will of a noble Roman. Augustus's campaign was vicious and effective. He circulated stories of her unbelievable luxury and depravity, portraying her as a threat to traditional Roman values. This was not just character assassination, it was a strategic necessity. By making the conflict about a foreign temptress, Augustus could frame his war not as a power grab against a Roman rival, but as a patriotic crusade to save the Republic from an external menace. His victory at Actium was celebrated as Rome's triumph over Eastern decadence and disorder. The poet Horace, writing under Augustus's patronage, captured this official line perfectly, referring to Cleopatra as a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster. This deliberate caricature was so successful that it defined Cleopatra's image for centuries, obscuring her fluency in multiple languages, her administrative acumen, and her desperate struggle to preserve her nation's independence. The tragedy of Cleopatra's legacy is that this Roman propaganda became the dominant historical record. Later Western artists, playwrights, and filmmakers, from Shakespeare to Hollywood, almost invariably leaned into the seductress archetype, further entrenching the image Augustus had so carefully constructed. They focused on her relationships with Caesar and Antony, reducing her life to a series of romantic entanglements rather than a complex political career. The real Cleopatra, the astute economist who managed Egypt's vast grain reserves, the naval commander who led her own fleet, the diplomat who negotiated with the most powerful men of her age, was buried beneath layers of prejudice and myth. It has taken the work of modern historians to scrape away these accumulated falsehoods and reveal the formidable ruler beneath. They point to the simple fact that she successfully ruled a wealthy and volatile kingdom for over 2 decades, navigating the treacherous politics of the late Roman Republic with remarkable skill. Her story is a stark reminder that history is often written by the victors, but it is also a testament to the fact that the truth has a way of whispering through the cracks of official narratives. The enigma of Cleopatra's death is not just about how she died, but about how she was killed a second time by the words of her enemies, an act of erasure as deliberate in its own way as the chisels that tried to remove Hatshepsut from history. From the sun-drenched political theater of the Mediterranean, our search for whispered histories now takes us to a very different landscape, the misty, damp forests of Roman Britain, where the story of power was written not in palace intrigues but in the clash of iron and fire. Here we find a voice that was not a carefully modulated whisper, but a defiant roar that echoed across the land. Her name was Boudicca, queen of the Iceni tribe, and her tale is one of raw, unadulterated vengeance that brought the mighty Roman Empire to its knees on the very edge of its domain. To understand the fire of Boudicca's rebellion, we must first feel the cold weight of Roman occupation. The Iceni were a Celtic tribe in what is now East Anglia, and unlike some of their neighbors who fought to the death, they had initially made a strategic peace with Rome. Their king, Prasutagus, ruled as a nominally independent ally, a client king of the empire. He hoped this arrangement would protect his kingdom and his family after his death. In his will, he famously left his wealth to be shared between the Roman Emperor Nero and his own 2 young daughters. This was a desperate attempt to buy security, a belief that by acknowledging Roman supremacy, his family and his people would be spared the worst brutalities of conquest. But Rome, especially under a provincial administration hungry for glory and wealth, saw such a will not as a diplomatic gesture but as an opportunity. When Prasutagus died around the year 60, the Roman officials on the ground acted with breathtaking brutality. They treated the entire Iceni kingdom not as an allied territory with a legal inheritance, but as a conquered possession that had been bequeathed to them. The Roman procurator Catus Decianus sent his men to annex the kingdom, publicly flogging Boudicca, the widowed queen, and standing by as his soldiers raped her 2 daughters. This was more than a political annexation. It was a calculated act of terror designed to humiliate and break the spirit of the Iceni nobility, to demonstrate that no native ruler, not even an ally, had any rights that Rome was bound to respect. The response was not surrender but an inferno. Boudicca, her body scarred and her family violated, became the catalyst for a widespread uprising that had been simmering for years. The injustices were not hers alone. Other tribes, particularly the Trinovantes to the south, were seething under the weight of Roman rule. They had been forced to pay for a massive temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius in their former capital, Camulogenum, a constant, galling reminder of their subjugation. Veterans of the Roman army had been settled on their lands, displacing native families. Boudicca's personal tragedy gave voice to this collective fury. She unified these disaffected tribes into a colossal army, a force that ancient historians like Tacitus, drawing on eyewitness accounts, claimed numbered over 100,000 warriors. What is striking about her leadership is that she was a woman leading a Celtic society where war was traditionally a male domain, yet she commanded absolute respect. The classical sources describe her as tall and terrifying, with a fierce gaze and a mass of fiery red hair that fell to her hips. She would address her vast army from a chariot, her daughters beside her. Her speeches not just calls to battle, but powerful indictments of Roman greed and a passionate defense of Celtic freedom. She spoke of the choice between victory or death, famously declaring that while a man might live and be a slave, she was a woman fighting for her lost liberty, her battered body, and her violated children. This allied army, fueled by a righteous rage, became an unstoppable force of nature. Their first target was Camulogenum, modern-day Colchester. This was the heart of Roman civilian settlement in Britain, a symbol of their oppressive culture. The town was poorly defended, and despite a desperate last stand by a small garrison of soldiers holed up in the temple of Claudius, it was utterly annihilated. The rebels showed no mercy, massacring the entire population and reducing the city to a smoldering ruin. The 9th Legion, a Roman infantry force marching to the rescue, was ambushed and virtually wiped out, with only its cavalry escaping. News of this catastrophe sent shockwaves through the Roman administration. The procurator Catus Decianus, the man whose actions had sparked the revolt, fled in panic to Gaul. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was away on campaign in Wales, and by the time he rushed southeast, it was too late to save the next target, Londinium. London was already a thriving commercial hub, but it was undefended. Suetonius, a pragmatic soldier, made the grim calculation that he could not protect it. He abandoned the city to its fate, evacuating those who could keep up with his army. Boudicca's warriors swept in, burning London to the ground. A layer of red burned debris, known as the Boudiccan destruction horizon, can still be found by archaeologists deep under the modern city, a silent, physical testament to the fury of her assault. The rebels then moved northwest, repeating the pattern at Verulamium, modern St. Albans, a town populated largely by Britons who had collaborated with Rome. 3 major settlements were erased from the map, and tens of thousands of Romans and their allies were slaughtered. In a matter of weeks, Boudicca had not just challenged Roman authority, she had nearly succeeded in tearing its entire British project out by the roots, proving that even the most powerful empire was vulnerable to the fury of a wronged queen. While the Roman historians painted a vivid picture of Boudicca's rebellion with words, it is the silent, charred evidence buried deep underground that provides its most chilling and undeniable testimony. The ferocity described by Tacitus and Cassius Dio is not merely a literary flourish. It is a physical reality that archaeologists can literally hold in their hands. At the three Roman settlements she targeted, Camulogenum, Londinium, and Verulamium excavations have revealed a distinct, unmistakable signature of destruction, a thick, red layer of burnt debris, often referred to as the Boudiccan destruction horizon. This isn't a subtle discoloration in the soil. It is a dramatic stratum of ash, burned clay, shattered pottery, and charcoal that speaks of intense, widespread, and deliberate conflagration. Walking through the layers of history in these ancient cities is like turning the pages of a book. You pass through the normal occupational layers of Roman life, the foundations of houses, the remnants of shops, and then you hit this vivid red line, a scar in the earth that marks a single catastrophic event. Below it lies the thriving early Roman town. Above it, after a period of abandonment, the careful reconstruction ordered by the empire. This fiery layer is the ghost of Boudicca's rage, preserved for 2,000 years. The evidence from each city tells a slightly different story, corroborating and sometimes complicating the historical accounts. At Camulogenum, modern Colchester, the destruction is absolute. Archaeologists have found the remains of the Temple of Claudius, the very symbol of Roman oppression that was the focus of the rebels' hatred. The evidence shows that the building was systematically torn apart and burned. But perhaps the most poignant finds are the smaller, personal items. Jewelry melted into unrecognizable lumps, metalwork twisted by extreme heat, and the remains of inhabitants who did not escape, their bones found in positions of terror caught in the collapsing buildings. In Londinium, the layer is equally dramatic, a blanket of fire that covered the entire early settlement. The speed and intensity of the burning were so great that it carbonized and preserved organic materials that would normally have decayed, such as wooden writing tablets. These tablets, scorched but legible, contain the mundane business records of Roman Londoners, their daily lives frozen in a moment of sudden, violent collapse. At Verulamium, modern St. Albans, the pattern repeats, confirming the systematic nature of the rebellion's campaign. This physical evidence does more than just prove the revolt happened. It confirms its scale and its method. The fires were not accidental or limited. They were a coordinated act of total annihilation, exactly as the Roman writers claimed. Yet, for all the concrete proof of the rebellion's destructive power, we run into a profound historical silence when we seek its end. The only detailed accounts of Boudicca's final, decisive defeat come from her enemies, the Romans Tacitus and Cassius Dio. This presents a monumental challenge for historians, as these sources are inherently biased, crafted to serve a specific narrative of Roman superiority and the restoration of order. Tacitus, writing decades later, had access to first-hand accounts, possibly even from his father-in-law, Agricola, who served in Britain. But his primary goal was to critique Roman society through the lens of history, often idealizing noble barbarians like Boudicca to highlight Roman corruption, while still ultimately justifying imperial expansion. He describes a final, great battle where the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus, a brilliant tactician, chose a narrow, defile-like battlefield where the massive British numbers would be a hindrance rather than an advantage. According to Tacitus, the Romans, disciplined and heavily armed, formed a wedge formation and broke the British charge, then methodically slaughtered the tens of thousands of warriors and their families who had accompanied them to the battlefield in a wagon train. Boudicca, he concludes, poisoned herself to avoid capture. Cassius Dio, writing over a century later and with more florid detail, amplifies the drama. He provides the famous description of Boudicca as a towering, fierce-eyed woman with long, tawny hair, rousing her troops with powerful speeches about freedom versus slavery. His account of the final battle is similar in outcome but lacks the tactical specifics of Tacitus. The problem is that archaeology has been unable to pinpoint the location of this climactic battle. Despite numerous theories, no site has yielded the kind of massive, concentrated evidence of warfare such as weapons, armor, and human remains that would be expected from a battle of such immense scale. This absence forces us to question the Roman accounts. Did the battle happen exactly as they described? Did they exaggerate the size of Boudicca's army and the completeness of their victory to magnify their own glory? It is possible the final conflict was less a single, set-piece battle and more a series of brutal engagements, with the Romans leveraging their superior discipline to eventually crush the rebellion. The story of Boudicca's suicide, while dramatically fitting, also serves a Roman literary purpose. It provides a noble, clean end for a formidable enemy, much like Cleopatra's, neatly closing the chapter on a threat to the empire. The physical evidence confirms the rebellion's terrifying reality, but the fate of the queen herself remains one of history's great whispers, lost in the smoke of her own fires and the unquestioned victory proclamations of her conquerors. But the roar of battlefields and the intrigue of royal courts represent only one form of power. To find another, we must turn our attention to a different kind of arena, a place not of swords but of scrolls, not of political decrees but of mathematical theorems. Our journey now takes us to the bustling, intellectually charged city of Alexandria in the final days of the Roman Empire, to a woman whose life and death would come to symbolize the violent end of an ancient world of learning. Her name was Hypatia, and her story is not one of a queen or a warrior, but of a philosopher, a teacher, and a mind so brilliant that her very existence became a threat in a city descending into chaos. Hypatia was born around the year 350 into an Alexandria that was still the greatest center of knowledge the world had ever known. Its legendary library, though diminished from its classical peak, was part of a larger intellectual ecosystem that included the Serapeum Temple and the vibrant community of scholars who flocked to the city. She was the daughter of Theon, a renowned mathematician and astronomer in his own right, and he ensured his daughter received an education that was extraordinary for any person, let alone a woman of that era. Theon was a devoted teacher, and he famously stated that he intended to raise his daughter as a perfect human being, cultivating not just her intellect but her physical and spiritual well-being. Hypatia surpassed even his lofty ambitions. She immersed herself in the study of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, eventually becoming the head of the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria. This was not an honorary title, it was a position of immense prestige, placing her at the very apex of the city's intellectual life. Students, both pagan and Christian, traveled from across the empire to attend her lectures on the works of Plato and Aristotle. She was celebrated not just for her knowledge but for her character. Historical accounts describe her as possessing a formidable modesty and a serene dignity. She was said to move through the city in a simple philosopher's cloak, engaging in public discussions with city officials and ordinary citizens alike, always ready to offer her wisdom without any air of superiority. In an age where women were largely excluded from public intellectual life, Hypatia commanded respect through the sheer force of her intellect and her virtue. Her contributions to science and philosophy were substantial, though much of her written work has been lost to the violence that would later consume her. We know she collaborated with her father on commentaries of great mathematical texts such as Ptolemy's Almagest, a foundational work on astronomy, and Euclid's Elements. She also wrote her own original commentaries on the conic sections of Apollonius of Perga, complex geometrical concepts that were at the cutting edge of mathematical thought. More than just a commentator, she was an inventor, credited with designing an improved version of the astrolabe, a device used for measuring the positions of stars and planets, and a hydroscope, an instrument for determining the density of liquids. These were not mere academic exercises, they were practical tools that extended human understanding of the natural world. Her philosophy, rooted in Neoplatonism, sought to understand the universe through reason and mathematics, seeing a logical, beautiful order behind creation. This commitment to rational inquiry, to the life of the mind, placed her in a tradition that stretched back to the giants of Greek thought. But the world outside her lecture hall was changing rapidly, and the values she embodied, reason, tolerance, and secular knowledge, were becoming dangerously out of step with the times. For the Alexandria of Hypatia's later years was a tinderbox of religious fanaticism. The rise of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire had transformed the city's social fabric. What was once a relatively harmonious, if competitive, mosaic of pagans, Jews, and Christians was now a scene of intense sectarian conflict. Theophilus, the powerful Christian bishop of Alexandria, had orchestrated the destruction of the Serapeum in 391, a devastating blow to pagan culture and learning. When his even more zealous nephew, Cyril, became bishop in 412, the tensions escalated into open street violence. Cyril mobilized gangs of militant monks and parabolani, a group of zealous lay attendants, to intimidate and attack his opponents, both Jewish and pagan. Hypatia, as a prominent pagan intellectual who advised the Roman prefect of the city, Orsts, found herself caught in the middle of this dangerous power struggle. Orsts, a Christian himself, frequently sought Hypatia's counsel on matters of governance, valuing her wisdom and impartiality. Their close relationship, however, was viewed with deep suspicion by Cyril's faction. In their eyes, Hypatia was not a neutral philosopher. She was a symbol of the old pagan order, a powerful influence who was supposedly using magic and her intellect to turn the prefect against the bishop. Her very existence, her continued prestige and influence among the city's elite, became an intolerable challenge to Cyril's authority. In a city now governed by the logic of the mob, a woman revered for her reason was about to become the target of unreasoning hatred. The tranquility of Hypatia's lecture hall, a sanctuary of reason and debate, could not protect her from the storm gathering in the streets of Alexandria. The city had become a battleground for souls, and the new bishop, Cyril, wielded a form of power far removed from the philosophical pursuits of the academy. He saw the world in absolutes, the triumphant truth of his faith against the dangerous errors of paganism and Judaism. Hypatia, though respected by many Christians for her wisdom, represented everything his faction sought to eradicate. She was a pagan, a woman who exercised immense public influence, and a close advisor to the Roman prefect Orsts, whose political authority Cyril was determined to undermine. The conflict between Orsts and Cyril escalated from a political rivalry into something much darker, with Cyril's fanatical supporters, particularly the Parabolani, a group of zealous lay attendants clashing violently with the prefect's guards. In this feverish atmosphere, Hypatia became a primary target. Cyril's propagandists began a smear campaign, portraying the esteemed philosopher not as a scholar but as a malevolent sorceress. They spread rumors that she used satanic charms and astrological magic to bewitch Orsts, turning his heart against the Christian community and preventing a reconciliation with the bishop. Her intellect, once her greatest asset, was now twisted into a weapon against her. The end came with horrifying suddenness. In the month of March in the year 415, as Hypatia was being transported through the city in her chariot, a mob descended upon her. This was not a spontaneous outburst of rage. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush led by a church lector named Peter. They dragged her from her carriage and into a church, the Caesarium, which had once been a site of imperial cult worship but was now consecrated for Christian use. This choice of location was deeply symbolic, a deliberate defilement of a pagan intellectual within a space that represented the new order. There, in a scene of unspeakable brutality, they stripped her naked. Using broken pieces of pottery known as ostraca and likely tiles ripped from the roof itself, they flayed the skin from her body, scraping the flesh from her bones while she was still alive. The accounts from this period are stark and unflinching in their horror. After this prolonged and agonizing torture, they dismembered her corpse, carrying the mutilated parts of her body to a place called Sinaran, where they burned them on a pyre. The violence was not just about killing a person, it was about erasing her very essence, reducing a symbol of wisdom and virtue to a nameless, charred remnant. Hypatia's murder was far more than the tragic death of a single individual. It was a seismic event that sent a shockwave through the ancient world. For many contemporaries, it marked a definitive break with the past. It signaled that the cosmopolitan, intellectually pluralistic ideal of classical antiquity, where philosophy could be pursued alongside faith, was no longer tenable. The world had entered an age where religious orthodoxy could sanction mob violence to silence dissent. The Roman authorities, weakened and distant, offered little meaningful response. Augustus was reportedly horrified, but his power was clearly broken. He soon faded from the historical record. Cyril, though perhaps not directly ordering the specific method of the killing, had created the conditions that made it inevitable, and he faced no serious consequences. The emperor's investigation was a muted affair, resulting only in a mild reprimand and a temporary limit on the number of parabolani. The message was chillingly clear: the life of a pagan philosopher, even one of Hypatia's stature, was expendable. In the centuries that followed, Hypatia's story was largely forgotten, suppressed by the very forces that had killed her, but she could not be silenced forever. The Enlightenment saw her rediscovery, and she was transformed into a potent symbol. For thinkers battling religious dogma, she became a martyr for reason and science. Voltaire cited her death as an example of Christian fanaticism, while others saw her as a victim of the destructive alliance between church and state. In the modern era, her symbolism has expanded further. She has become an iconic figure for feminists, representing the historical persecution of intelligent and publicly influential women. Her story resonates because it is a stark reminder of the dangers faced by women who dare to claim a voice in spheres dominated by men. The image of a mob of men tearing apart a woman for her knowledge is a powerful and terrifying allegory for misogyny itself. Today, Hypatia stands as a timeless emblem of intellectual freedom, a warning from history about what happens when reason is supplanted by zealotry. Her death in that Alexandrian church was intended to be a final silencing, but instead it amplified her voice across the ages, a whisper of courage that continues to inspire the pursuit of knowledge against the tides of intolerance. Yet the story of Hypatia reminds us that the written record is often a fragile and biased thing, and sometimes the most powerful voices are those that were never written down at all. To find one of these voices, we must journey even further back in time, to a civilization so ancient that its history was recorded not on parchment but on oracle bones. We travel now to the heart of the Shang dynasty in China, around the 13th century before the Common Era, to meet a woman whose life shatters every preconception we might have about the roles of women in the ancient world. Her name was Fu Hao, and she was not merely a queen. She was a military commander, a high priestess, and a political force so significant that her story, once lost for over 3,000 years, was resurrected in a single, breathtaking archaeological discovery. To appreciate Fu Hao, we must first understand the world of King Wu Ding, one of the most powerful and dynamic rulers of the Shang dynasty. This was a time of constant warfare and expansion, a Bronze Age kingdom where the king's authority was cemented through military might and his unique relationship with the spirit world. The Shang practiced a form of divination using oracle bones, primarily the shoulder bones of cattle and the plastrons of turtles. They would inscribe questions onto these bones, apply heat to create cracks, and then interpret the patterns as messages from their ancestors and gods. It is from these very inscriptions, these ancient questions carved into bone, that we have recovered the details of Fu Hao's extraordinary life. She appears not as a footnote, but as a central and active participant in the affairs of state. King Wu Ding had many consorts, a common practice to forge political alliances, but Fu Hao stands apart. The oracle bones reveal a relationship that was far more than ceremonial or diplomatic. Wu Ding consulted the spirits about every aspect of her life, her health, her pregnancies, even her military campaigns. He was clearly deeply invested in her well-being and her success, treating her as a crucial partner in his reign. What makes Fu Hao truly unique is the sheer breadth of the authority she wielded. In an era where leading armies was the ultimate expression of royal power, Fu Hao was not just a supporter of the military, she was one of its foremost generals. The oracle bones record her leading numerous campaigns, commanding forces that numbered up to 13,000 soldiers, a colossal army for the time. She fought against the Tu Fang, the Yi, the Qiang, and other neighboring tribes that threatened the Shang borders. One inscription famously notes a specific battle where she led the charge, and the king, through divination, sought to know if the weather would be favorable for her. This was not a queen watching from a safe distance. This was a field commander whose tactical decisions could determine the fate of the kingdom. Her success on the battlefield was so renowned that after her death, the king continued to make sacrificial offerings to her spirit, asking for her martial assistance in subsequent wars. She had been transformed in death into a protective deity of the Shang state, a testament to the awe in which her military prowess was held. But her power was not confined to the battlefield. Fu Hao also held the highest religious office in the land, that of a high priestess. In the Shang worldview, the line between the political and the spiritual was blurred. Conducting rituals and communicating with the ancestors was a core function of governance, a duty typically reserved for the king and his most trusted male shamans. Yet, the inscriptions show Fu Hao presiding over major ceremonies and leading sacrifices. She was responsible for offering precious goods, bronze vessels, jade, even human and animal sacrifices, to appease the powerful spirits and secure their blessing for the dynasty. This dual role as both general and priestess is almost unparalleled in the ancient world. It suggests a figure of immense personal authority and spiritual gravitas, a woman who could command armies in the physical realm and intercede with the gods in the spiritual one. Furthermore, the records indicate that she was a major landowner, managing her own estates and their agricultural production. This economic independence gave her a power base separate from the royal court, making her one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the entire kingdom. For over 3 millennia, Fu Hao was nothing more than a name scattered across cryptic inscriptions, a ghost in the archaeological record. Her full story might have remained a tantalizing mystery if not for a discovery that can only be described as a miracle of preservation. In 1976, archaeologists working at the ancient Shang capital of Yin, near modern-day Anyang, made a stunning find. They uncovered a tomb, designated Tomb Number 5, that was completely intact. Unlike nearly every other royal burial from the period, which had been plundered by grave robbers over the centuries, this one had escaped detection. When they opened it, they were not just finding artifacts, they were encountering a person frozen in time. The tomb was Fu Hao's final resting place, and it confirmed every incredible detail the oracle bones had suggested. The chamber was filled with a treasure that testified to her immense status. There were over 440 bronze artifacts, including massive ritual vessels inscribed with her name, some of the most magnificent examples of Bronze Age craftsmanship ever discovered. There were nearly 600 jade objects, a stone revered in Chinese culture for its beauty and spiritual properties. There were ivory carvings, over 7,000 cowrie shells, which were used as currency, and the grim remains of 16 human sacrifices and 6 dogs sent with her to serve in the afterlife. The sheer scale and richness of the burial goods left no doubt. This was not just any consort, this was a woman of supreme power and wealth, laid to rest with honors befitting a king. The discovery was revolutionary because it provided physical, tangible proof of a woman who held roles that historians had long assumed were exclusively male in ancient Chinese society. The military gear confirmed her status as a general, the ritual vessels affirmed her role as a priestess. Fu Hao was no longer just a name in an ancient text, she was a historical reality, her life story written in bronze and jade. Her tomb stands as a powerful corrective to the historical record, a vivid reminder that our assumptions about the past are often incomplete. While the names of kings were carefully recorded for posterity, the story of a woman like Fu Hao was nearly lost to time, waiting silently in the earth for the right moment to whisper her incredible truth back into the world. The discovery of Fu Hao's tomb was not merely an archaeological success. It was like lifting a veil on a world everyone thought they knew, only to find a completely different reality waiting beneath. For centuries, scholars had pieced together the story of the Shang dynasty from fragments, broken oracle bones, the foundations of palaces, and the scattered remains of looted graves. They understood it as a patriarchal, warrior-based society, and the idea that a woman could hold the highest military and religious offices seemed, at best, a romantic interpretation of ambiguous text. All of that changed in the spring of 1976, when archaeologists working at the Yingsu site, the ancient Shang capital, carefully excavated a modest-looking pit designated simply as Tomb Number 5. What they found inside was a time capsule of such staggering wealth and personal significance that it single-handedly rewrote the history of women in ancient China. The tomb was completely intact, a miracle of preservation in an area where virtually every other royal burial had been plundered over the millennia. This was not just a collection of artifacts, it was Fu Hao's personal universe laid to rest around her, waiting for over 3,000 years to testify to her true stature. The sheer volume and quality of the treasures were breathtaking. The most immediate symbols of her authority were the weapons. Buried alongside her were over 130 bronze weapons, including massive battle axes. In Shang culture, the battle axe was not just a tool of war, it was the ultimate symbol of military command, a regal scepter of power reserved for the king and his most trusted generals. The presence of these axes in her tomb, some of extraordinary size and decorated with intricate designs of dragons and tigers, was incontrovertible physical proof. They were not ceremonial tokens, they were functional weapons confirming the oracle bone inscriptions that described her leading armies into battle. But her power was multifaceted, and the tomb reflected every dimension of it. Alongside the instruments of war were the tools of ritual. The chamber contained over 460 exquisite bronze objects, but the most impressive were the 210 ritual vessels. These were not mere decorations, they were the essential equipment for communicating with the ancestors and gods. There were cauldrons for cooking sacrificial meat, goblets for offering wine, and steamers for preparing grain. Many were inscribed with her name, Fu Hao, declaring her ownership and her role as the officiant of these sacred ceremonies. The quantity and quality of these vessels surpassed those found in the tombs of many kings, indicating that her religious authority was not secondary to her military role but existed alongside it, equally profound and respected. Perhaps the most telling category of objects was the jade. The tomb yielded nearly 700 jade artifacts, a collection of unprecedented scale and variety. For the Shang, jade was more than a precious stone. It was believed to possess spiritual qualities, a substance of purity and immortality that could protect the soul in the afterlife. The jades buried with Fu Hao were not a random assortment. There were ritual blades symbolic of authority and personal adornments like hairpins and bracelets. But there were also miniature versions of everyday objects and creatures from the world she ruled: birds, fish, dragons, and even a small, perfectly carved turtle. This suggests a deeply personal connection to these items, a curated collection that reflected her life, her status, and her beliefs. Furthermore, the tomb contained over 6,800 cowrie shells, the currency of the Shang kingdom. This immense wealth was a clear indication of her economic independence. She controlled vast resources and estates, giving her a power base that was entirely her own, separate from the king's treasury. Finally, the grim reality of Shang burial practices was present. The skeletons of 16 humans and 6 dogs sacrificed to accompany her into the afterlife. This practice, brutal to modern sensibilities, was a privilege of the highest rank. These individuals were likely her personal attendants, warriors, or shamans, sent to continue their service in the next world, a final, stark demonstration of the authority she wielded in life and the honor accorded to her in death. The impact of this single discovery on our understanding of ancient Chinese society cannot be overstated. Before tomb number 5 was opened, the powerful women of later Chinese history, like the Han Dynasty's Empress Lu or the Tang Dynasty's Wu Zetian, were often viewed as brilliant anomalies, exceptions who managed to seize power in a rigidly patriarchal system. Fu Hao's tomb presented a radically different narrative. Here was a woman over 1,000 years earlier who was not an exception to the rule but appeared to be fully integrated into the highest echelons of power as a matter of course. The evidence was not a biased historical text written by court historians with an agenda, but the physical, undeniable proof of her own possessions, placed in her grave by her contemporaries. It proved that in the formative period of Chinese civilization, the potential for women to hold supreme military and religious authority was not just a possibility, it was a reality. The tomb showed that gender roles in the Shang dynasty were far more complex and fluid than anyone had dared to imagine. Fu Hao was not ruling from the shadows or through manipulation. Her authority was explicit, publicly celebrated, and formally recognized with all the symbols of kingship. She was a general, a priestess, a landowner, and a queen all at once, and her society honored her with a burial that reflected every facet of her colossal influence. Her rediscovery forced historians to confront their own assumptions and acknowledge that the whispers of female power in the earliest records were not myths, but memories of a truth that had been waiting, quite literally, in the ground for its moment to speak. Yet the story of Fu Hao demonstrates that power could be formally recognized and celebrated. But our next journey reveals a rise to influence so dramatic it seems to defy the very fabric of the society it occurred within. We travel now from ancient China to the heart of the Byzantine Empire, to a city of gleaming domes and brutal intrigues, Constantinople. Here, in the 6th century, we meet a woman whose life story reads like an impossible fiction, a trajectory from the very bottom of the social ladder to its absolute pinnacle. Her name was Theodora, and her journey from the scandalous stage to the sacred throne is one of history's most astonishing transformations. To understand the magnitude of Theodora's ascent, we must first appreciate the chasm that separated her origins from her destiny. She was born into the lowest strata of Byzantine society. Her father was a bear keeper for the Greens, one of the city's dominant chariot racing factions, a job that placed the family on the margins of respectability. When he died, her mother, desperate to provide for her 3 young daughters, remarried and pleaded with the Greens to grant her late husband's position to her new husband. In a public spectacle at the Hippodrome, the massive chariot racing arena that served as the city's political and social heart, the Greens refused. In a moment of sheer desperation, the mother turned to the rival faction, the Blues, who took pity on the family and granted the stepfather the position. This early humiliation played out before thousands of screaming fans, ingrained in Theodora a profound understanding of the fickle nature of power and patronage. Forced to earn a living, Theodora and her sisters turned to the stage. But in the Byzantine world, an actress was not a respected artist. The profession was legally and socially synonymous with prostitution. Actresses were considered morally corrupt, their lives a public spectacle off stage as much as on. Theodora worked as a comic actress and a dancer, and contemporary sources, particularly the scandalized historian Procopius in his secret work The Secret History, paints a lurid picture of her early life, depicting her as a woman of infamous reputation and shocking behavior. While we must view Procopius's account with extreme skepticism, it was written to vilify her and Justinian. It underscores the immense social stigma she had to overcome. She was, by the rigid standards of her time, an utterly improbable candidate for empress. Her path to power began with a strategic withdrawal from Constantinople. She traveled to North Africa as the companion of a Syrian official, but after that relationship ended, she made her way to Alexandria. This journey was the turning point in her life. In Alexandria, a city still echoing with the intellectual and religious debates of the ancient world, Theodora underwent a profound conversion. She encountered monophysite Christianity, a sect that believed Jesus Christ had a single, holy divine nature, which was condemned as heresy by the official Orthodox Church in Constantinople. This was a crucial development. The monophysites were powerful in the eastern provinces of the empire, and Theodora would remain a steadfast, secret supporter of theirs for the rest of her life, giving her a unique political base and a network of influence outside the capital's Orthodox establishment. She abandoned her former life, returning to Constantinople a changed woman, earning a modest living as a spinner of wool. She settled in a house near the palace, and it was there, through a carefully managed introduction, that she caught the eye of Justinian, the nephew and heir apparent to the aging Emperor Justin I. Justinian was immediately captivated. He was a man of immense ambition, consumed with grand plans to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory through military conquest, legal reform, and monumental building projects. In Theodora, he found not just a beautiful woman, but a partner of extraordinary intelligence, political acumen, and a will as strong as his own. She possessed something he lacked, an intimate, street-level understanding of the volatile populace of Constantinople, the very mob that could make or break an emperor. Their relationship faced immediate and fierce opposition from the court, particularly from Justinian's aunt, the Empress Euphemia, who was horrified at the idea of her nephew marrying a woman of such disreputable background. But Justinian was determined. So great was his devotion that he pressured his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change an ancient law that forbade high-ranking aristocrats from marrying actresses. With this legal barrier removed, Justinian and Theodora were married in 525. When Justin died 3 years later, they were crowned as Emperor and Empress of the Roman world. The bear-keeper's daughter now wore the imperial purple, but the true test of Theodora's mettle, the moment that cemented her status not as a mere consort but as a co-ruler in every sense of the word, came just 5 years into their reign. It was an event that would expose Justinian's vulnerability and showcase Theodora's unparalleled courage. The Nika riots. The trouble began, as it often did, in the hippodrome during the chariot races. The two main factions, the Blues and the Greens, who were normally bitter rivals, united in their fury against Justinian's government, particularly over his high taxes and his ruthless, efficient ministers. The cry of Nika, meaning conquer or win, erupted from the crowd, and the protest spiraled into a full-scale rebellion. For days, the city was consumed by fire and violence. The rioters proclaimed a new emperor, a nephew of a former ruler, and laid siege to the imperial palace where Justinian and his court were trapped. With much of the city in flames and the palace guard unreliable, the situation seemed hopeless. Justinian's advisors, panicked and fearing for their lives, urged him to flee. They had a fast ship ready at the palace harbor, prepared to whisk the emperor to safety in exile. It appeared that the reign of Justinian was over. In this moment of total despair, as the men around him counseled cowardice, Theodora rose to speak. Her address, as recorded by the historian Procopius, was one of the most decisive speeches in history. she rejected the plan for flight with utter contempt. Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is scarcely the question. She is reported to have said, "I believe that flight, even if it brings us to safety, is not in our interest. Every man born to see the light of day must die, but that one who has been an emperor should become an exile is intolerable. May I never be separated from this purple, and may I not live to see the day when those who meet me do not call me empress." She concluded with the legendary line, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Her meaning was clear. It was better to die as empress in the palace than to live as a fugitive. This stunning display of resolve shamed the men and steeled Justinian's nerve. Her speech transformed the council's mood from panic to determination. With a new plan, Justinian turned to his loyal generals Belisarius and Mundus, who led their troops into the hippodrome where the rebels were gathered. Trapped in the great arena, an estimated 30,000 insurgents were slaughtered. The rebellion was crushed in a single, bloody afternoon. Theodora's courage had saved the empire. From that day forward, she ruled alongside Justinian as his absolute equal. Her name included in imperial decrees, her influence felt in every corner of policy, from law and religion to diplomacy and court intrigue. A true empress who had earned her purple not by birth but by the sheer force of her will. Yet the story of Theodora's courage during the Nika riots reveals only one dimension of her power. Her true legacy was carved not just in moments of crisis, but in the patient, systematic work of governance that followed. Once her position as co-ruler was unshakable, she turned her unique understanding of society's darkest corners into a force for profound legal and social change. Drawing from the hardships she had witnessed and experienced in her own early life, Theodora became a relentless advocate for those with no voice in the glittering halls of power, particularly women. She leveraged her unparalleled influence over Justinian to reshape the very legal fabric of the empire, transforming the Byzantine legal code into an instrument of compassion and reform. Her efforts demonstrate that her strength was not merely about holding on to power, but about using that power to redefine justice itself for the most vulnerable. One of her most significant campaigns targeted the systemic exploitation of women and girls. Theodora understood intimately the precarious existence of those on the margins, and she moved to abolish forced prostitution. She enacted laws that closed down the notorious brothels of Constantinople, not by punishing the women trapped within them, but by targeting the owners and procurers who profited from their desperation. The law offered women a genuine escape route, providing them with financial support and a path to a new life. But Theodora's compassion was paired with pragmatism. Recognizing that these women needed a safe haven, a place to rebuild their lives without the stigma of their pasts, she undertook one of her most personal projects, the founding of a convent on the Asian side of the Bosphorus, in a palace known as the Metanoia, or Repentance. This was far more than a religious institution. It was a sanctuary, a state-funded shelter where former prostitutes could live with dignity, receive an education, and learn a trade. Theodora did not just sign a decree and move on. She took a direct personal interest in the Metanoia, ensuring it was well provisioned and that the women there were treated with respect. This initiative showcases the complex interplay in her character. The unwavering empress who could order the massacre of 30,000 rioters was also the woman who dedicated immense resources to saving a few hundred souls from destitution and despair. Her legal reforms extended deeply into the realm of marriage and family law, areas where women had traditionally held very little power. Theodora pushed through groundbreaking legislation that expanded the rights of women in divorce, challenging centuries of tradition. Previously, a woman could only divorce under extremely limited circumstances, often leaving her trapped in abusive or miserable marriages. Theodora's laws broadened these grounds significantly, allowing women to initiate divorce if their husbands were convicted of treason or conspiracy, or if they had been unjustly imprisoned. More strikingly, she introduced laws that protected women from being forced into marriages against their will, and she strengthened the penalties for rape, treating it not as a private offense but as a serious public crime. In matters of property, she ensured that widows received a rightful share of their husband's estate, protecting them from being disinherited by greedy relatives. She also secured for mothers greater guardianship rights over their own children, a radical shift in a legal system that had always privileged the father's lineage. These were not minor adjustments, they were a fundamental rebalancing of the scales of justice, granting women a legal personhood they had rarely possessed before. Theodora's legacy, therefore, is a tapestry woven with threads of iron and silk. She was a ruler who understood power in all its forms, the brutal force required to crush a rebellion and the subtle, enduring influence required to change a law. Her motivations remain a subject of historical debate. Some see her reforms as an act of sincere penance, a way to atone for her own past by lifting up others who shared her former struggles. Others view it as a brilliant political strategy, solidifying her base of support among the common people and ensuring social stability. The most compelling interpretation, however, is that both are true. Theodora's life had given her a perspective no other emperor or empress could claim. She had seen the empire from the gutter and from the throne, and she used that unique vantage point to govern with a blend of ruthless realism and profound empathy. The laws she championed survived for centuries within the Justinianic Code, influencing legal systems long after the Byzantine Empire itself had fallen. While the gold and mosaics of the Hagia Sophia stand as a monument to Justinian's ambition, the legal protections extended to countless anonymous women across the empire stand as the enduring monument to Theodora's heart, a whisper of compassion etched into the cold stone of law. But if Theodora's power was wielded from a throne she fought to defend, our next story reveals a different kind of ascent, one built not on public defiance but on a web of bloodline, betrayal, and cold, calculated ambition that stretched into the very heart of the imperial family. From the tumultuous arena of Constantinople, we travel back to the epicenter of the earlier Roman Empire, to a dynasty so synonymous with power and madness that the name alone evokes a shudder, the Julio-Claudians. And here, navigating the deadliest currents of this family with a survivor's instinct and a ruler's ambition, we find Agrippina the Younger, a woman who did not just marry power or inherit it, she engineered it with the precision of a master architect. To understand Agrippina is to understand that she was born into a world where power was a family affair, and her bloodline was both her greatest asset and her most dangerous curse. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first emperor, and the daughter of the celebrated general Germanicus, a beloved figure whose untimely death sparked rumors of poisoning. Her mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman of formidable will who openly clashed with the suspicious Emperor Tiberius and was ultimately exiled and starved to death for her defiance. This upbringing was a brutal political education. From her earliest years, Agrippina witnessed the stark reality that proximity to the throne was a knife's edge. She saw relatives exalted and then destroyed, learning that in the imperial court, sentiment was a liability and survival required a steeliness that few possessed. Her first marriage to a wealthy aristocrat produced a son. That son's name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, but the world would soon know him by another name, Nero. From the moment of his birth, Agrippina saw in her son not just a child, but a vessel for her own ambition, the ultimate tool to secure a power that had eluded her mother. Her opportunity began to unfold during the chaotic reign of her brother, the Emperor Caligula. Initially, she and her sisters were showered with honors, but Caligula's paranoia quickly turned against his own family. He reportedly had an incestuous relationship with his sisters, viewing them as extensions of his own power, but later exiled Agrippina for her alleged involvement in a conspiracy. She was forced to carry the ashes of another executed relative in an urn, a deliberate act of humiliation. This experience, rather than breaking her, only hardened her resolve. When Caligula was assassinated and her kindly, underestimated uncle Claudius became emperor, Agrippina saw her opening. Claudius was bookish and easily influenced by those around him, particularly his wives. His current wife, the beautiful and notorious Messalina, saw Agrippina as a threat and maneuvered to have her removed from court. But Messalina's own ambitions led to her downfall when she publicly married a lover in a brazen attempt to seize power, a move that resulted in her execution. The position of empress was suddenly, shockingly vacant. What followed was one of the most audacious and cold-blooded political campaigns in history. Agrippina, now back in Rome, set her sights on becoming the wife of her own uncle, the Emperor Claudius. This was no simple courtship. Roman law and social custom explicitly forbade marriages between uncles and nieces. But Agrippina was undeterred. She leveraged every ounce of her influence, persuading a compliant senator to argue before the Senate that such a union was in fact a matter of national importance. They claimed it would strengthen the imperial family and ensure stability. The law was changed and the marriage took place. Agrippina, now empress, moved with breathtaking speed to consolidate her power. She secured the title of Augusta, a honorific that granted her immense prestige. She established her own court faction, placing loyalists in key military and administrative positions. Most crucially, she began the systematic removal of rivals, real or imagined, who stood between her son, Nero, and the throne. The most significant obstacle was Claudius's own son, Britannicus, who was younger than Nero but was the direct biological heir. Agrippina worked tirelessly to sideline him, ensuring that Nero was promoted and celebrated at every turn while Britannicus was kept isolated and powerless within the palace. Her masterstroke, however, was the adoption. She convinced the aging and increasingly frail Claudius to legally adopt Nero, making him his official heir and placing him ahead of Britannicus in the line of succession. This was a monumental achievement, a piece of political theater that secured the future she had plotted for years. But for Agrippina, adoption was not enough. The final, undeniable step was the one she is most infamous for. In the year 54, the Emperor Claudius died after eating a dish of mushrooms. While the official cause was natural, ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius are unanimous in their belief that Agrippina poisoned him. They describe her using a known poisoner named Locusta to prepare the deadly dish, ensuring her son Nero would ascend without further delay. With Claudius dead, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal army, was immediately sworn into Nero. Agrippina had orchestrated every detail, from the change in law to the final, fatal meal. For a brief, glorious moment, she had achieved the impossible. She was the sister of one emperor, the wife of another, and now the mother of a third. She was the first woman in Roman history to hold such a trifecta of power, and she fully intended to rule through her young son, becoming the de facto empress of the Roman world. Yet the absolute power that Agrippina had so meticulously constructed was destined to be as fragile as it was formidable, built upon a relationship that would ultimately become her undoing. Her son Nero, the very instrument of her ambition, was growing from a pliable boy into a young man with a will and a paranoia of his own. The woman who had engineered his rise to the throne could not simply switch off her controlling nature. She saw herself as the power behind the throne, the seasoned architect of the empire, and she expected to continue ruling through him. She insisted on attending meetings with him, even having herself seated beside him, only separated by a curtain, so she could whisper advice during his audiences with foreign ambassadors and senators. For Nero, this was no longer guidance. It was a humiliating and very public reminder that he was still seen as a child, a puppet whose strings were pulled by his mother. The very influence she had fought so hard to secure was now the very thing that would turn her greatest creation against her. The methods attributed to Agrippina for removing obstacles reveal a chilling sophistication that fed her poisonous reputation. Ancient historians, particularly Tacitus, describe her reliance on a specialist, a woman named Locusta, who was a known and condemned poisoner. The collaboration was said to be so precise that they treated the act like a dark science. When the first attempt on the Emperor Claudius failed, reportedly causing him to purge the poison through a bout of illness, Agrippina and Locusta were forced to innovate. They allegedly devised a second, more insidious method. Knowing that Claudius was particularly fond of mushrooms, they prepared a deadly dish. But instead of poisoning the entire meal, the story goes that they poisoned a single, choice mushroom. The emperor ate it and fell ill, but the effects were not swift enough for Agrippina's comfort. Fearing he might recover and discover the plot, she then supposedly bribed his personal physician to administer a second, final dose, this time using a feather dipped in a fast-acting toxin and slipped down the emperor's throat under the guise of helping him vomit. This layered, almost theatrical approach to murder cemented her image as a master of the poisoner's art, a woman who would patiently and ruthlessly refine her methods until the job was done. The final break between mother and son was as predictable as it was tragic. Nero, encouraged by a new set of advisors who saw Agrippina as a threat to their own influence, began to openly rebel. The breaking point often centers on his love affair with Poppaea Sabina, a sophisticated and ambitious woman who would become his second wife. Poppaea is portrayed as relentlessly whispering in Nero's ear, questioning why a grown man, an emperor, should still be subordinate to his mother. She reportedly taunted him, suggesting that the Senate and the people respected Agrippina's lineage more than his own authority, and that his mother's continued presence was a direct challenge to his power. Whether Poppaea was the primary cause or merely a catalyst, Nero's mind was made up. He resolved that his mother must die, but killing an empress, especially one as popular and well-connected as Agrippina, was no simple task. It had to look like an accident to avoid a political firestorm. What followed was not a single, clean strike, but a series of bizarre and almost farcically elaborate attempts that read like a dark comedy of errors. The most famous of these failed plots involved a brilliantly engineered piece of naval sabotage. Knowing that Agrippina was traveling by boat to visit him, Nero ordered a special vessel to be constructed for her return journey. This was no ordinary ship. It was a death trap designed to look like a tragic accident at sea. The craft was built to collapse on itself at a predetermined time. The lead roof of the cabin was weighted with a large quantity of lead designed to fall and crush her as she slept. Yet, when the mechanism was triggered, the plan went awry. The roof did collapse, but it only killed one of her attendants who was resting on a couch directly beneath it. Agrippina herself was saved by the high sides of her own couch, which fortuitously took the brunt of the impact. Another version of the story suggests the ship was meant to simply sink, but the design was flawed. As the vessel began to take on water, Agrippina's quick thinking and the chaos of the moment worked in her favor. She was thrown into the water, and though she was injured, she managed to swim to safety, aided by a small boat that happened to be nearby. She immediately understood what had happened. This was no accident. It was an assassination attempt orchestrated by her own son. Cold, wet, and wounded, but with her wits entirely about her, Agrippina knew that her only chance for survival was to pretend she knew nothing. She sent a messenger to Nero, calmly informing him that she had survived a terrible shipwreck, but thanking the gods that he was spared such a terrible worry. She assured him she was recovering and begged him not to trouble himself with a visit. This was a masterstroke of dissimulation. By feigning ignorance, she hoped to buy time, to force Nero into a position where a second, more direct attack would be politically impossible. But Nero was now in a panic. His elaborate ruse had failed spectacularly, and his mother was not only alive but was now on high alert. His advisor, the Praetorian prefect Burrus, reportedly refused to have his guards carry out the murder. There was no turning back. In his desperation, Nero turned to a man named Anicetus, the freedman who had designed the faulty ship. Anicetus, now implicated in the failed plot, had no choice but to see it through. He took a band of sailors and rushed to Agrippina's villa. The scene that followed was one of chilling finality. The men burst into her home, finding her in her bedroom lit by a single lamp. According to Tacitus, in her final moments, Agrippina displayed the same fierce courage that had defined her life. As the assassin drew his sword, she allegedly pulled herself up and presented her abdomen, uttering the grim command, "Strike here." Pointing to the womb that had borne the emperor, it was a last devastating indictment, a final reminder of the intimate bond he was severing. The deed was done quickly. When Nero received the news, he is said to have inspected the body himself, coldly remarking that he did not know he had such a beautiful mother. The aftermath was a hollow spectacle of public relations. Nero claimed his mother had been plotting against him and that she had taken her own life when discovered, but no one was truly fooled. The murder of Agrippina the Younger marked a point of no return for Nero's reign, a descent into a tyranny that would eventually consume him. The mother who had built an empire for her son was destroyed by the very monster she had created, a tragic end to one of history's most formidable and complex political minds. However, the story of a mother's ambition giving way to her son's paranoia represents a very personal kind of power struggle within the palace walls. To witness a challenge to imperial authority on a truly geopolitical scale, we must turn our gaze eastward to the shimmering oasis city of Palmyra, where a queen emerged who did not just manipulate the empire from within, but dared to confront it directly on the field of battle. Her name was Zenobia, and in the tumultuous 3rd century, she carved out an empire of her own, temporarily shattering Rome's hold on the East and fashioning herself as the heir to legendary queens of antiquity. Palmyra was no ordinary city, situated at a critical crossroads of trade routes linking the Roman Empire with Persia, India, and China. It had grown immensely wealthy as a caravan city, a cosmopolitan hub where Eastern and Western cultures met. Its people were a mix of Arab, Aramaic, and Greco-Roman influences, and for centuries they had skillfully maintained a delicate semi-independence under the loose supervision of Rome. This all changed with the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of profound instability for Rome that saw the empire nearly collapse under a relentless combination of civil war, foreign invasion, and economic meltdown. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often meeting violent ends. It was in this power vacuum that Zenobia's star would rise. She was the wife of Odenathus, the king of Palmyra, who proved to be a remarkably loyal and capable ally to Rome. When the Persian Sasanian Empire captured the Emperor Valerian in a humiliating defeat, it was Odenathus who rallied the Eastern legions, pushed the Persians back, and restored order. For his service, he was granted extraordinary titles and authority, effectively making him the unofficial ruler of the Roman East. But after Odenathus and his heir were assassinated under mysterious circumstances around the year 270, power fell to his young son, Vabilathus, with Zenobia acting as regent. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Rather than maintaining the cautious loyalty of her husband, Zenobia saw the empire's continued weakness as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She began to style herself not merely as a regent for a client king, but as a sovereign queen in her own right. To legitimize her rule, she crafted a powerful public persona, famously claiming descent from none other than Cleopatra Roman VII of Egypt. This was a masterstroke of propaganda. By linking her lineage to the last great pharaoh, she tapped into a legacy of female power, Hellenistic culture, and resistance to Rome that resonated throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. She presented herself as the true inheritor of the East's glorious past, a cultured ruler who could restore its independence and prestige. With this vision driving her, Zenobia embarked on a breathtaking military campaign that stunned the Roman world. She first consolidated her control over the Roman province of Syria. Then, in a move of staggering ambition, she ordered her general, Zabdas, to invade the wealthiest province of the entire empire, Egypt. The breadbasket of Rome, whose grain was essential for feeding the city's massive population, fell to her armies. The Roman garrison was defeated, and Zenobia's forces pushed south along the Nile. At the same time, her armies swept northward into Anatolia, conquering territory as far as the Bosporus Strait, near modern-day Istanbul. In a matter of a few short years, she had effectively severed the Eastern Roman Empire from its western heartland, controlling a vast domain that stretched from the borders of Persia to the edge of Europe. She established her court at Palmyra, but also took up residence in Antioch and Alexandria, ruling as a monarch equal to the Roman emperor. Zenobia's power, however, was not solely military. She was a noted scholar and a patron of culture, transforming her court into a vibrant intellectual center. Fluent in Greek, Aramaic, and Egyptian, she surrounded herself with philosophers and theologians, most notably the revered thinker Cassius Longinus, who served as her chief advisor. She tolerated and even encouraged religious diversity, including Jews and Christians alongside pagans in her administration. She presided over a brief but brilliant cultural flowering, a Pomeran Renaissance that blended Greek learning with Eastern traditions. On her coinage, she did not depict herself as a subservient client queen. She had coins minted showing her own portrait on one side, and on the other, the image of her young son, Vabilathus. Initially, these coins also bore the face of the current Roman emperor, Aurelian, acknowledging his nominal seniority. But as her confidence grew, Aurelian's image disappeared, leaving only the two Pomeran rulers. This was a clear and deliberate declaration of independence, a signal to the world that a new empire had been born in the East, with Zenobia as its undisputed leader. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the Roman Empire might be permanently divided, and that a new Hellenistic kingdom, ruled by a warrior scholar queen, would take its place. Zenobia's stunning conquests, however, could not go unanswered forever. As she consolidated her Pomeran Empire, a new and formidable Roman emperor finally emerged from the chaotic whirl of the 3rd century, a man whose very name would come to mean restorer of the world, Aurelian. He had spent the first years of his reign securing the Danube frontier and defeating Germanic invaders, but the East was now his paramount concern. The existence of a separatist state controlling Egypt, the grain supply for Rome itself, was an existential threat to the empire. Aurelian, a soldier's soldier known for his discipline and relentless energy, assembled his legions and marched east in the year 272. He was not coming to negotiate, he was coming to reclaim what he saw as stolen Roman territory. The campaign was a masterpiece of rapid, decisive action. Aurelian first swept through Anatolia, meeting Zenobia's forces at the Battle of Emi, near the city of Antioch. Zenobia's army, commanded by her general Zabdas, relied heavily on the famed Pomeran heavy cavalry, known as the Clibanarii, armored horsemen who were among the most feared in the ancient world. Aurelian, a brilliant tactician, understood he could not meet this charge head-on. He feigned a retreat, drawing the Pomeran cavalry into a pursuit that exhausted both the riders and their horses under the hot Syrian sun. Once the enemy was disordered and fatigued, he wheeled his own fresh Dalmatian and Moorish cavalry around, counter-attacking with devastating force and routing Zenobia's army. The queen herself was forced to flee from Antioch to her capital, Palmyra, with Aurelian's legions in close pursuit. He defeated her again in a second battle near Emesa, modern-day Homs, where despite another strong showing by her cavalry, the tough, disciplined Roman infantry ultimately carried the day. The final act of the drama unfolded at the gates of Palmyra itself. The city was a magnificent oasis fortress, but it was not prepared for a long siege against the full might of a determined Roman army. Aurelian surrounded the city, cutting it off from the desert trade routes that were its lifeblood. inside the walls, Zenobia's situation grew increasingly desperate. According to the ancient sources, she attempted to escape from the city on a fast dromedary, hoping to reach the Persian Empire and seek aid from her former enemies, the Sasanians. She almost succeeded, but Aurelian's cavalry intercepted her near the Euphrates River as she tried to cross by boat. Her capture broke the spirit of the Pomeran resistance. The city, recognizing the hopelessness of its plight, surrendered shortly thereafter. Aurelian, perhaps impressed by her courage or seeking to avoid further bloodshed, spared the city itself, though he confiscated its immense treasures. The Pomeran Empire, which had so briefly challenged Rome, was extinguished almost as quickly as it had flared into existence. But with the Queen in chains, a new chapter began, the enduring mystery of her ultimate fate. The most famous story, recounted by ancient historians like Zosimus, is that Zenobia was brought back to Rome to be displayed in Emperor Aurelian's magnificent triumph in the year 274. This victory parade was designed to showcase the restoration of the empire, and Zenobia would have been its ultimate trophy. The accounts describe her being paraded through the streets of Rome not in iron chains, but bound with fetters of gold, so heavy with jewels and precious metals that she could barely walk under their weight. This detail is crucial. Gold chains were not a sign of mercy, they were a symbol of the magnitude of the conquest. By dressing his captive in such opulent restraints, Aurelian was emphasizing the immense wealth and power of the foe he had defeated, thereby magnifying his own glory. The story goes that after the triumph, Aurelian, in a surprising act of clemency, granted her a comfortable retirement. He was said to have given her an elegant villa in Tivoli, near Rome, where she lived out her days as a respected Roman matron. Her children married into distinguished senatorial families. This neat ending, however, is shrouded in doubt. Other historical traditions offer a much darker conclusion. Some sources suggest that Zenobia died on the journey to Rome, either from illness or by starving herself to death, refusing to endure the humiliation of a triumph. Another, grimmer version claims that after being paraded through the streets, she was executed, as was the traditional fate for many of Rome's most significant enemy leaders. The truth is likely lost to time. The Villa in Tivoli narrative is almost too perfect, serving the political needs of Aurelian by casting him as a magnanimous victor and safely taming the legend of the rebellious queen by transforming her into a harmless Roman aristocrat. It effectively neutralized her as a symbol of ongoing resistance, and it is as a symbol that Zenobia truly achieved immortality. Regardless of her physical fate, her legend only grew in the centuries after her death. In the Arab world, she became a heroic figure of pre-Islamic history, a wise and powerful queen who championed her people. In Western culture, she was rediscovered during the Renaissance and became an icon of female power and resistance against tyranny. For artists, playwrights, and later filmmakers, she represented the exotic, learned, and fiercely independent East standing up to the brute force of Rome. Her story resonates because it is a classic tale of audacious ambition against overwhelming odds. She was a woman who, in a moment of supreme imperial weakness, dared to dream of carving out her own kingdom, and for a few brilliant years she succeeded. The mystery of her end only adds to her power. By vanishing into the fog of history, she escaped final definition by her conquerors. Zenobia remains forever the unconquered queen of the popular imagination, a whisper of defiance that no golden chain could ever truly silence. But if Zenobia's story is one of empires and armies, our search for whispered histories now turns to a far more intimate, yet equally powerful realm, the landscape of the human heart. To find this voice, we must travel to the sun-drenched island of Lesbos in the Aegean Sea, around the 6th century before the Common Era, to a woman whose words were so captivating that the ancient world revered her as a mortal muse. Her name was Sappho, and though her story is shrouded in the same mists of time, the fragments of her poetry that have survived are like lightning bolts brief, brilliant illuminations that reveal a world of feeling previously unrecorded. In her own time, Sappho's fame was unparalleled. She wasn't just a respected poet, she was a cultural icon. Plato, writing 2 centuries after her death, referred to her as the 10th muse, elevating her to the status of the 9 goddesses who were the very source of artistic inspiration. This was the highest compliment possible, suggesting her work was not merely human craft but something divine. On coins minted in Lesbos, her face was stamped alongside those of legendary poets like Alcaeus, a testament to her local and enduring prestige. In an age where public life and great art were overwhelmingly the domain of men, celebrating heroic deeds and epic wars, Sappho's voice emerged from a different space entirely. She wrote from within a world of women for an audience of women. Historical evidence suggests she led a thiosos, a kind of educational or cultural community for young women from wealthy families, where they were prepared for marriage and adult life, learning everything from music and dance to poetry. It was within this context that her work was created, not for the grand stages of Athens, but for the more private settings of her island, often performed to the accompaniment of the lyre, which is why we call her poetry lyric. And what she chose to write about was nothing short of revolutionary. While Homer was chronicling the rage of Achilles and the cunning of Odysseus, Sappho turned her gaze inward, exploring the tumultuous and exquisite terrain of human emotion with a candor that feels startlingly modern. Her central theme was love eros in all its forms, the sweet anticipation, the bliss of presence, and most famously, the agonizing pain of longing and rejection. She gave us the word bittersweet to describe love, capturing its paradoxical nature in a single, perfect term. Her poetry is intensely personal and sensory. She doesn't speak in abstract ideals, she describes the physical, overwhelming symptoms of desire. In her most famous surviving poem, Fragment 31, she depicts watching the man her beloved is speaking to, and the effect is a cascade of physical collapse. She writes, "For when I look at you, even for a moment, then I can no longer speak. My tongue is broken, and a delicate fire at once runs under my skin. I see nothing with my eyes, and my ears hum. Sweat pours down me, and trembling seizes all of me. I am paler than grass, and I seem to me to be little short of death." This is not a distant observation. It is a raw, visceral confession. She pioneered the first-person perspective in poetry, making the speaker's individual emotional experience the entire subject of the work, a focus that was virtually unprecedented. This focus on the inner lives of women was her great gift to history. Her poems provide a precious, almost miraculous window into the world of female friendship, mentorship, and community in ancient Greece. She writes of the girls in her circle with deep affection, celebrating their beauty and mourning their departures when they left the island to be married. In Fragment 94, she comforts a departing woman, promising, "I truly want to die." She then reminisces about the beautiful times they shared, the garlands of violets and roses they wore, the soft beds where they would lie together. The tone is one of profound, intimate loss, a testament to the powerful bonds formed between women, free from the gaze of the male-dominated public sphere. Her work is filled with the details of their lives, the scent of perfumes, the shimmer of woven cloth, the cool shade of apple orchards. She immortalizes the small, sacred moments of female existence that were almost always ignored by the official record. In doing so, she didn't just write poems, she created a sanctuary in words, a place where the emotions and experiences of women were treated as the most important subject in the world. And yet, the greatest tragedy of Sappho is that this sanctuary has been almost completely demolished by time. The scale of the loss is almost incomprehensible. Ancient sources tell us that Sappho composed 9 volumes of poetry, a vast body of work that was collected, studied, and admired for centuries in the libraries of Alexandria and Rome. But over the millennia, through a combination of neglect, the fragile nature of papyrus, and perhaps most significantly, deliberate censorship by later cultures that were uncomfortable with the frankness of her female-centric desire, her work vanished. The great volumes crumbled to dust. What we have today are not complete poems but whispers of them. Most survive as fragments, a single line quoted by another ancient author who was making a grammatical point, or a handful of words salvaged from the wrapping of an Egyptian mummy where scraps of papyrus were recycled as cartonnage. We have approximately 200 fragments, and of those only one poem, the Ode to Aphrodite, survives in its entirety. The rest are heartbreakingly incomplete, a beautiful image cut short, a powerful emotion left hanging. We have lines like, "The moon has set and the Pleiades, it is the middle of the night, time passes and I sleep alone," a perfect, lonely haiku of longing. But we have lost the stanzas that came before and after. This fragmentation, however, has created its own unique power. These splinters of verse are like ancient pottery shards. Their broken edges allow our imagination to fill in the gaps, to yearn for the lost whole. Each fragment is a concentrated dose of her genius, a reminder of the immense cultural wealth that has been erased, and a testament to the fragile nature of voices that dare to speak outside the mainstream. Sappho's legacy, therefore, is a double one. She is celebrated for the breathtaking beauty of the words that survived, and she is mourned for the ocean of verse that we will never know. The immense tragedy of Sappho's fragmented legacy forces us to confront the equally enigmatic figure of the poet herself, a woman whose personal life has been a subject of speculation and debate for over 2 millennia. The scarcity of facts has created a vacuum that has been filled with countless stories, some rooted in fragile evidence, others born from the biases of later eras. We know she lived on the island of Lesbos, that she came from an aristocratic family, and that she had a daughter named Clays. Beyond these few anchors, her biography drifts into the realm of mystery. The most persistent and profound debate surrounds her sexuality, a discussion that has ironically been shaped by the very fragments of her poetry that survive. Her passionate, intimate verses addressed to other women are the source of the words lesbian and sapphic, yet ancient and modern interpreters have fiercely contested their meaning. In her own time, such expressions of love and desire between women may have been understood within the context of the educational thiosos she led, a community where intense, mentoring relationships between older and younger women were a recognized part of a girl's preparation for life and marriage. The poetry could be seen as celebrating these formative bonds. Later Greek comedians, however, began to caricature her as sexually promiscuous and obsessed with women, a portrayal that often carried a mocking tone. For centuries of Christian scholarship, there was a concerted effort to reinterpret her work, to frame her as a moralistic schoolteacher, or even to invent a story of her falling in love with a ferryman named Phaon and killing herself when he rejected her, a tale with no historical basis but one that served to impose a conventional heterosexual narrative onto her life. The modern understanding, of course, sees her as a foundational icon of same-sex love. This evolution of her image is a history in itself, a stark reminder of how each generation projects its own values and anxieties onto the silent figures of the past, attempting to solve a mystery that the evidence will never fully resolve. Another captivating mystery is the nature of her famous school. The idea of Sappho presiding over a formal academy for young women, a kind of ancient finishing school, is a romantic one. Historical evidence suggests she did lead a thiosos, but its precise function is unclear. Was it primarily a religious group dedicated to the cult of Aphrodite? Was it a practical institution where daughters of the nobility were taught music, poetry, and dance to increase their value as brides? Or was it something more, a sanctuary for intellectual and artistic development away from the patriarchal structures of the city? The poems themselves suggest an environment of deep emotional and aesthetic cultivation. She writes of weaving garlands, of sharing perfumed oils, of the pain of separation when a beloved girl leaves to be married. This paints a picture of a closed, intensely bonded female community. The mystery deepens when we consider her own position. Was she a revered mother figure, a beloved mentor, or something more complex? The power dynamics within the Thiosos are lost to us. What remains is the echo of a unique social space where the voices and feelings of women were the central concern, a rare pocket of female-centered culture in the ancient Greek world whose exact contours we can only dimly perceive. The final, personal mystery is the circumstances of her death. The ancient world offered multiple, often contradictory accounts. The most famous is the legend of Phaon, which claims she leapt to her death from the white cliffs of the island of Lucas due to her unrequited love for the young man. This story, repeated by writers like Ovid, is almost certainly a fictional tragedy invented long after her death. Other traditions suggest she died peacefully of old age in her homeland. The truth is, we simply do not know, but this personal mystery is overshadowed by a far greater, more consequential loss, the systematic destruction of her voice. For centuries after her death, Sappho's work was not lost, it was revered. The 9 volumes of her poetry were collected, edited, and preserved in the 2 greatest libraries of the ancient world, the Library of Alexandria and the Library of Pergamum. Scholars pored over her verses, and she was considered a classic on par with Homer. This is what makes the loss so profound. It was not an immediate accident, but a slow, grinding erasure over centuries. The fires that periodically ravaged the Library of Alexandria undoubtedly consumed some of the papyrus scrolls containing her work, but the destruction was likely also a result of neglect and deliberate censorship. As the cultural tastes of the Greco-Roman world shifted, and as Christianity rose to dominance, a poet who celebrated sensual pleasure and love between women fell out of favor. The Church Fathers, like Tatian and Gregory of Nazianzus, condemned her work as immoral. In an age where scribal labor was expensive, the decision to stop recopying a text was a death sentence. The scrolls that survived in libraries slowly crumbled from use or were left to rot, their papyrus becoming brittle and turning to dust. The vast majority of her 9 volumes simply ceased to be reproduced, their contents vanishing because they no longer aligned with the values of the powerful institutions that controlled knowledge. What we have today are the scraps that were quoted by other authors for grammatical illustration, or that were miraculously preserved in the dry sands of Egypt, used as stuffing for mummy cases or as scrap paper. This is why her legacy is a collection of fragments, a line about the evening star, a phrase about the sound of a lover's voice, a heartbreaking description of loneliness. These are the splinters of a magnificent mosaic. The silence surrounding her words is as powerful as the words themselves. It is a silence created by fire, by neglect, and by intolerance, a void that whispers loudly of the immense cultural wealth that has been stripped from our understanding of the ancient world. Sappho's story, therefore, is not just about the poet we know, but about the colossal presence of the poet we have lost. But the story of Sappho reminds us that some voices, though fragmented, were preserved on fragile papyrus, while others were carried on the winds of rebellion, shouted from the backs of war elephants. To hear one of these defiant echoes, we must journey far from the Aegean Sea to the lush, river-fed lands of ancient Vietnam, a territory known then as Lac Viet. Here, in the 1st century of the Common Era, the local people labored under the heavy hand of the Chinese Han dynasty. The Han had annexed the region over a century earlier, imposing a strict and often cruel administrative system designed to extract wealth and impose Chinese culture. Taxes were crushing, land was confiscated for Chinese settlers, and the indigenous traditions of the Lac Viet people were systematically suppressed. It was into this atmosphere of simmering resentment that 2 sisters were born, whose names would become a permanent cry for freedom: Trung Trak and Trung Nhi. The sisters were raised in an aristocratic family in My Linh, a district known for its strong martial traditions. Their father was a local lord, a lac lord, which afforded them an education and a position of leadership within their community. They were well versed in the martial arts and the art of strategy, unusual for women even in their own society, which held more equitable views on gender than the rigidly patriarchal Chinese system they opposed. The catalyst for their rebellion was an act of profound personal and political injustice. Trung was married to a nobleman named Hatshepsut, who shared her family's hatred of the Han occupiers. When Hatshepsut organized protests against the increasingly brutal Chinese governor, Su Ding, the response was swift and ruthless. To make an example of him and crush the spirit of resistance, the Chinese executed Hatshepsut, and as a further humiliation, they refused to return his body for a proper burial according to local customs. This was not just the murder of a political rival, it was a calculated act of cultural annihilation, an attack on the very soul of the Lac Viet people. For Trung, it transformed grief into an unquenchable fire. Alongside her sister, Trung Nhi, she turned her mourning into a mobilization. The sisters understood that a conventional military challenge was impossible. The Han forces were too well equipped and numerous. Instead, they launched a movement, a popular uprising that tapped into the deep well of frustration across the land. Their call to arms was electrifying. They traveled from village to village, not just appealing to the nobility, but rallying the common people. History records that they assembled an army of tens of thousands, and what makes their story so extraordinary is the prominent, even dominant, role that women played in its leadership. Of the generals who swore allegiance to the Trung sisters, a significant number were women, including their own mother and Feng Thai Chin, a legendary figure who was said to have given birth on the eve of a major battle and fought with her infant strapped to her back. In the year 40, the rebellion erupted with stunning force. The Trung sisters' forces, though lacking the formal training and iron weaponry of the Han army, were fueled by a righteous fury and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. They attacked from the swamps and forests, employing guerrilla tactics against the rigid formations of the Chinese. The uprising spread like wildfire across the countryside. One by one, the Chinese-held citadels fell. The hated governor, Su Ding, fled in panic for his life, abandoning his administrative seat. Within a remarkably short time, the sisters had achieved the unimaginable. They had liberated 65 fortresses and driven the Chinese military apparatus out of their homeland. With the territory secured, the sisters did not simply return to their estates. In a move of breathtaking ambition, they proclaimed themselves the joint rulers of an independent kingdom, with Trung taking the title of queen, often rendered as Trung Vuong. They established their capital at Milin, their ancestral home, and began the work of governing a free nation. For 3 years they ruled, abolishing the oppressive Chinese tax system and working to restore the indigenous customs and rituals that had been suppressed for generations. It was a fleeting but glorious moment of self-determination, a kingdom ruled by women, forged in the fires of resistance. This hard-won independence, however, could not withstand the relentless might of the Han Empire forever. The Chinese Emperor Guangwu viewed the rebellion not as a local insurrection but as a direct challenge to imperial authority that could inspire unrest elsewhere. He dispatched his most seasoned general, Ma Yuan, a brutal and effective commander, with a massive expeditionary force to crush the Trung sisters' kingdom. The final confrontation, which began around the year 42, was a mismatch of military scale and technology. Ma Yuan's army was a professional, well-supplied force skilled in set-piece warfare. The Vietnamese forces, though courageous and fighting for their homeland, were ultimately overwhelmed by the disciplined Han legions. The decisive battle is said to have taken place at Lang Bach. Facing certain defeat and capture, the Trung sisters made a choice that would cement their legend forever. Rather than surrendering to face the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of the Chinese capital, they chose to die by their own hands. According to the most popular tradition, they walked into the Hatjiang River and drowned themselves, a final act of defiance that denied the Chinese a victory in its entirety. The Han dynasty reasserted control, imposing an even harsher rule in an attempt to extinguish the spirit of Vietnamese nationalism once and for all, but the opposite occurred. The sacrifice of the Trung sisters did not end the story, it became the story. In death, they were transformed from mortal rulers into immortal national symbols. Their legacy was kept alive through folk songs, poems, and oral histories, passed down from generation to generation. They became goddesses in the Vietnamese folk religion, with thousands of temples known as Dinh, dedicated to their worship across the country. For centuries, whenever Vietnam faced foreign domination, whether from Chinese dynasties or later colonial powers, the story of the Trung sisters was invoked to stir the spirit of resistance. They proved that the desire for freedom was stronger than any army, and that leadership could come from the most unexpected of places. Their 3-year kingdom was a beacon, a proof of concept that Vietnam could be and should be independent. The whispers of their rebellion became a roar that echoes through 2,000 years of history, a foundational myth of national identity built not by kings, but by sisters who dared to lead an army of women to victory, and whose ultimate defeat became the seed of an eternal hope. The 3 years of freedom that the Trung sisters had won were a brief, brilliant flash of lightning in the storm of history, but the thunder of the Han Empire's response was inevitable. The Chinese Emperor Guangwu could not allow a rebellious kingdom to stand on his southern frontier, a beacon of defiance that might inspire other subject peoples. He dispatched one of his most formidable generals, Ma Yuan, a veteran of countless campaigns, with a massive professional army to crush the uprising once and for all. The confrontation that followed was a tragic mismatch. The Vietnamese forces, though fueled by passion and an intimate knowledge of their homeland, were fundamentally a people's militia. They faced the crushing weight of imperial military science, disciplined legions, advanced siege equipment, and an inexhaustible supply chain. The guerrilla tactics that had served them so well in liberating their fortresses were less effective against Ma Yuan's methodical, overwhelming advance. The decisive battle, believed to have been fought at Lang Bak, was a massacre. The sisters' army, brave to the end, was systematically broken by the superior Han forces. Facing the grim reality of total defeat and the certain prospect of a humiliating capture, the Trung sisters made a choice that would transform their story from a military failure into an eternal legend. Rather than being taken prisoner to be paraded through the streets of the Han capital as trophies of war, they chose to die on their own terms. According to the most enduring tradition, the sisters, in their full royal regalia, walked to the Hatjiang River. There they prayed to the heavens and the spirits of their ancestors before wading into the waters, drowning themselves in a final, defiant act of freedom. This was not an act of despair, but one of profound symbolic power. In Vietnamese culture, as in many others, water is a sacred element, a source of life and purification. By returning themselves to the land through its rivers, they denied their enemies the ultimate victory of subjugating their bodies and their spirits. Their suicide was a declaration that their cause was more precious than life itself, an ultimate rejection of foreign dominion. The Han dynasty reconquered the territory and imposed a rule even harsher than before, attempting to extinguish the very memory of Vietnamese identity. But the sacrifice of the sisters had the opposite effect. In death, they were transfigured. They became the Hai Ba Trung, the two Trung ladies, and their legend was kept alive not in official Chinese histories, but in the whispered stories, folk songs, and oral traditions of the Vietnamese people. They evolved from historical figures into national deities, symbols of the unyielding spirit of resistance. This process of myth-making saw their story grow in scale and wonder. Legends arose that they did not merely drown, but ascended to heaven on the backs of giant elephants. Another powerful tale speaks of their decapitated heads, thrown into the river by the Chinese, being recovered by giant turtles, sacred creatures in Vietnamese folklore who returned them for a proper burial. These stories were not mere fanciful additions. They were a form of psychological and cultural warfare, a way for a subjugated people to claim a spiritual victory even in the face of political defeat. Today, the legacy of the Trung Sisters is woven into the very fabric of Vietnam. They are celebrated as the country's first national heroes across the nation, but especially in their ancestral homeland of My Linh and in Hanoi. Hundreds of temples or din are dedicated to their worship. These are not mere museums, they are active centers of community and veneration. The most important festival is held annually on the 6th day of the second lunar month, believed to be the anniversary of their deaths. It is a vibrant, colorful event featuring processions, traditional music, and symbolic reenactments of their rebellion. Perhaps the most striking feature of these celebrations is the central role of women. Elderly women often take leading roles in the rituals, and young girls participate in ceremonies, embodying the spirit of the female generals who once led the army. This is a powerful and persistent thread in Vietnamese culture, a recognition of the capacity for female leadership in times of crisis, a legacy directly inherited from the Trung Sisters. Their story resonates so deeply because it encapsulates the core narrative of Vietnamese history, the struggle of a small nation to maintain its identity against much larger, aggressive neighbors. For 2,000 years, whenever Vietnam has faced foreign domination, the story of the Hai Ba Trung has been invoked. They were a rallying cry during resistance against subsequent Chinese dynasties, a source of inspiration during the fights against French colonialism and the turmoil of the 20th century. They represent the idea that the desire for freedom is an unstoppable force, and that true leadership is defined by courage and sacrifice, not by gender or formal power. The 3-year kingdom they built may have fallen, but the nation of the spirit that they founded has never been conquered. The whispers of their rebellion, carried on the currents of the Hat Giang River, became a roar that echoes through the centuries, a timeless reminder that some defeats plant the seeds of ultimate victory. But if the story of the Trung Sisters is one of a rebellion whose echoes grew louder with time, our search now takes us to a voice so ancient that its very existence marks a beginning. We must travel back more than 4,000 years to the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, to the gleaming ziggurats of the city of Here we encounter a figure who stands at the very dawn of recorded history, not as a queen or a warrior, but as a poet and a priestess. Her name was Enheduanna, and she holds a title that resonates with profound significance. She is the first author in all of human history known to us by name. Before Enheduanna, writing existed, but it was primarily functional. Scribes recorded quantities of grain, lists of kings, and the details of commercial transactions. Literature, the expression of personal emotion, devotion, and identity, was anonymous. Stories of gods and heroes were passed down orally, their creators lost to time. Enheduanna shattered this anonymity. She was the daughter of one of history's first great empire builders, Sargon of Akkad. Sargon had conquered the independent city-states of Sumer, uniting the Akkadian-speaking north with the Sumerian-speaking south into a single, sprawling domain. But military conquest is one thing, unifying a fractured empire with deep cultural and linguistic divisions is another. Sargon's genius was to understand that true power required not just the sword but also the pen. And for this delicate task of ideological fusion, he turned to his daughter. He appointed her to the supremely powerful and prestigious role of High Priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of the spiritual heart of Sumer. This was a masterstroke of political strategy. By placing a member of his own family at the apex of the Sumerian religious establishment, Sargon was signaling his respect for their traditions while simultaneously ensuring his influence permeated their most sacred institutions. Enheduanna was no mere puppet, however. she embraced her role with a brilliance that far exceeded its political purpose. She recognized that the gods of the Akkadians and the Sumerians were largely the same deities with different names. Her great project became the theological and literary unification of the empire through a series of powerful hymns known as the Sumerian temple hymns. In these works, Enheduanna performed a remarkable act of synthesis. She wrote hymns that deliberately intertwined the Akkadian and Sumerian pantheons, emphasizing their shared attributes and creating a unified divine hierarchy that mirrored the new political reality of Sargon's empire. She didn't just translate, she created a new imperial mythology. For example, she elevated the Akkadian goddess of love and war, Inanna, who was synonymous with the Sumerian Ishtar, to a position of unparalleled power, identifying her with the planet Venus and portraying her as the driving force behind cosmic order and royal authority. In doing so, she provided a divine justification for her father's rule, suggesting that the empire itself was the will of the gods, a sacred project overseen by the priesthood she led. What makes Enheduanna's work so revolutionary, however, is not just its political cleverness but its deeply personal voice. In one of her most famous compositions, The Exaltation of Inanna, she breaks from formal praise to recount a personal crisis. She describes being exiled from Ur by a rebel leader who opposed Sargon's dynasty. In passionate first-person verse, she pours out her anguish and her desperation, pleading directly to the goddess Inanna for restoration. She writes, "I am priestess, I am the high priestess. I have borne the ritual basket, I have sounded the song of joy, but I am now in exile. My body has been taken from me, I am as a dead woman." This is an astonishing moment. For the first time in history, we hear an individual's inner world, their fears, their hopes, and their relationship with the divine. She signs this poem, literally carving her identity into the clay tablet with the words, "The compiler of the tablets was Enheduanna." It is an act of self-assertion, a declaration of authorship that echoes across 43 centuries. The survival of her voice is itself a miracle. Her hymns were so revered that they were copied by scribes for centuries after her death, becoming part of the standard curriculum for scribble schools across Mesopotamia. Because of this, we have multiple copies of her work preserved in the libraries of ancient cities like Nippur and Ur. These copies allow us to reconstruct her words with remarkable accuracy. Enheduanna's legacy, therefore, is twofold. She was a political visionary who used the power of poetry to build an empire, crafting a shared cultural identity from disparate parts. But more importantly, she was a literary pioneer who dared to say "I." In a world of anonymous records, she claimed ownership of her words and her emotions, opening a door to the human heart that every poet, every novelist, and every songwriter who followed would walk through. She is the root from which the vast tree of world literature grows, the first whisper of a creative spirit that we can still call by name. Enheduanna's extraordinary literary achievement was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather a brilliant manifestation of a well-established institution. She stands as our most famous example of a powerful figure whose role was surprisingly common in the ancient world, the high priestess. In the complex societies of Mesopotamia, from the Sumerian city-states to the Akkadian and Babylonian empires that followed, royal daughters were frequently appointed to the highest religious offices. This was not a ceremonial honor, it was a strategic placement that gave these women immense, tangible authority over the very pillars of civilization. The temple was far more than a place of worship. It was an economic powerhouse, a vast corporate entity that owned enormous tracts of farmland, managed herds of livestock, controlled craft workshops, and served as a central bank for storing and distributing wealth. As the chief executive of one of these temple complexes, a high priestess like Enheduanna was essentially the CEO of a massive, diversified corporation. She would have overseen a small army of administrators, scribes, farmers, and artisans, making critical decisions that affected the food supply, the distribution of goods, and the economic stability of the entire city-state. Her influence was not confined to the sacred precinct. It was woven into the daily life and economic heartbeat of the kingdom. This economic power directly translated into significant political clout. A high priestess was often the king's most trusted representative in the city's most important institution. Her appointment was a key tool of royal policy, a way for the king to solidify his control over a city's religious life and, by extension, its wealth. By placing his daughter in such a role, a king like Sargon was ensuring that the immense resources of the temple would be managed in the empire's interest. The priestess, in turn, acted as a divine intermediary, using her religious authority to legitimize her father's or brother's rule. She would lead rituals and offer prayers that were believed to ensure the city's prosperity and military success, making her a crucial partner in maintaining the social and political order. The correspondence of these women, preserved on clay tablets, reveals them engaging in high-level diplomacy, negotiating with other city-states, and advising their royal relatives on matters of state. Their voices carried weight because they controlled resources and held a direct line to the gods. What is truly remarkable is how this system, for a time, created a legitimate and respected space for women to wield public power in a way that would become increasingly rare in later centuries. Unlike in classical Greece or Rome, where elite women's influence was largely exerted behind the scenes within the domestic sphere, the high priestesses of Mesopotamia operated in the full glare of public life. Their names were recorded on foundation stones, their deeds celebrated in inscriptions. They commissioned building projects and left behind statues of themselves in poses of devotion and authority. This was a society that, while still patriarchal, recognized a specific and powerful public role for women of the highest birth. The authority of the high priestess was a recognized part of the political and religious fabric, a parallel power structure to the king himself. Enheduanna's ability to write herself into history was therefore enabled by a system that already acknowledged the capacity of women to hold such profound responsibility. Her genius was in using the tools of that system, the written word, religious ideology, and administrative authority, to create something entirely new and enduring, cementing her own legacy while simultaneously fulfilling the duties of her office. From the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt to the misty riverlands of Vietnam, from the marble halls of Rome to the scholarly circles of Alexandria, the journeys we have taken reveal a truth far more profound than a simple collection of remarkable lives. We have met women who are not anomalies but archetypes of power in its many forms. Hatshepsut, the architect of her own divine kingship; Boudicca, the fury of a wronged people given a voice; Hypatia, reason itself in a world descending into zealotry; and Fu Hao, whose very tomb rewrote our understanding of ancient authority. We witnessed the political genius of Cleopatra, the legal reforms of Theodora, the calculated ambition of Agrippina, and the defiant empire-building of Zenobia. We heard the intimate, revolutionary voice of Sappho and stood at the dawn of literature with Enheduanna, and we felt the enduring spirit of national identity in the sacrifice of the Trung Sisters. What binds these disparate lives across continents and millennia is not a single definition of success, but a shared constellation of human strengths, immense ambition that refused to be contained by the limits of their time, a sharp intelligence that navigated the most treacherous of political landscapes, and a resilience that allowed them to endure exile, slander, and even the threat of total erasure. Their stories are unified by a constant, often brutal, struggle against the forces that sought to silence them, whether through the literal chisels of Thutmose III, the poisonous propaganda of Octavian Augustus, the mob violence sanctioned by Cyril, or the simple, grinding neglect that consigned Sappho's volumes to dust. History, as it has been handed down, is not a neutral record. It is a narrative shaped by the victors, the scribes, and the powerful, and these women consistently posed a threat to the established order they represented. And that is precisely why their recovery is so vital. To listen for these whispers is to participate in an active reconstruction of our past, to acknowledge that the grand, single-story narrative of history is incomplete. It is to understand that power was not always wielded on the battlefield or from a throne. It could be exercised in a courtroom through law, in a temple through ritual, in a poem through emotion, or in a classroom through knowledge. By seeking out these lost voices, we do more than just correct the historical record. We enrich our understanding of what is possible. We see the full spectrum of human potential, a tapestry woven with threads of both masculine and feminine experience that is infinitely more complex and beautiful than the monochrome version we are often taught. So let this journey be a beginning, not an end. Let it attune your ear to the whispers that linger just beneath the surface of the familiar stories. Question the narratives. Who is missing from this picture? What other voices have been marginalized, ignored, or deliberately silenced? The work of history is never finished. It is a continuous conversation between the past and the present. And now we turn that conversation over to you. We have walked with pharaohs and poets, generals and priestesses. Which of these extraordinary women left the deepest impression on you? Was it the strategic brilliance of Theodora, the heartbreaking fate of Hypatia, or the raw courage of Boudicca? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know which story resonated most and whose whisper you will carry with you.